Hello and welcome back to this series on mapping the shadow. Today is part 3, and this episode, I'm getting right to the heart of it. What exactly is the shadow? And it's important we define it. Is it defined? Is it definable? Has anyone else tried to define it? Well, this is one of the challenges I came up against in my initial study of the psychology of shadow and shadow work. And that is that there is really no universally agreed upon definition for the shadow. You can loosely say that, okay, it's the repressed, disowned parts of the psyche. Okay, yeah. What does that mean? And why does that happen? What about the parts of ourselves that we do know about, that we're very, very aware of? Maybe we still don't necessarily like them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not aware of them. So would that be shadow? Or would that not be shadow? Does it include traits, emotions? What about archetypes themselves? Which bits are shadow, which bits aren't shadow? It's quite clear that what we resist in ourselves can either be some form of how we like to show up. If we think of ourselves as very logical, well, invariably the ways that we show up are also the ways that we show power, at least in the early part of our lives. Does that mean that that's shadow if we do not like the way we use logic to serve power? Like, that's how we show up, we're aware of it, we don't really like it about ourselves, but sometimes it just sort of ends up happening. Is that because there's something hidden coming to the surface? Or is that because we're just trying to get our own way with all we know how to do? And to what extent are we aware of that, and to what extent is that shadow? So you see, there's all kinds of ways in which this way of thinking about shadow, I would say, doesn't really apply or doesn't help us. The other way of thinking about it, not how we show up, but how we don't show up, the opposite of how we show up. So again, if we think of ourselves as very logical, does that mean the shadow is something that's more feeling-based, more sensitive? Perhaps. Let's look at what some of the great thinkers on this have said. And I'm going to make the case that I think that philosophy and psychology can very much be reconciled in this area. Right, so onto a quote from James Hollis. He said very simply that the functional definition of the shadow is that which renders us uncomfortable in confronting in ourselves. Right, so it's part of us and we don't like it. We have to confront it. Presumably it's not entirely conscious. The reasons for that we're going to have to get onto later, but it renders us uncomfortable. So there's a resistance. And for that reason, we tend not to see it, or we don't like to go there. And maybe we find some impulsive way to distract ourselves. Before we know it, we're off onto the next thing. We've forgotten all about the event. Right. So this is a working definition of the shadow. I think it's a fairly good theoretical definition as well, with some important caveats. So here are some of my own thoughts on the shadow. So yes, of course, it is the unconscious realm of the psyche that contains repressed aspects of the individual's personality. But that can include several things. I've listed here these five elements of shadow, which in short are traits, emotions, beliefs, desires, and archetypes themselves. So just go into those a little bit more. This is a very practical list. This isn't designed to be the ultimate sort of list of what can be in there. It's a practical tool. But firstly, traits. This is what we most commonly associate with the shadow most of the time. Yes, of course, we always talk about emotions as well, but traits often, if you've come at this from, say, a personality type perspective, like a Myers-Briggs perspective, this kind of thing, the traits are usually considered to be like the shadow. And this also has roots in Jung's own writing, where he actually said this. We're going to look at that in a moment. So again, this could be efficiency versus kindness or authenticity. If you show up as one, the opposite might well be considered to be in our shadow. There's good reasons for that, because behaving as that prevents us from doing what we really want to do and what we needed to do to survive, to navigate the unconscious and the unknown at those early stages in our lives. But secondly here, emotions. So this is to say that when we encounter that energy of resistance, it leads to an emotion. We experience that as an emotion. And I've made the case again that this is simply the need for the mind to remain non-contradictory. So there's two disparate energetic forces in the mind. When they come together, that's experienced as a tension, a kind of suffering. And it has to. It's energetic. There's no way around it. Any attempt to get around it is simply a bypass that negates the real work, that avoids the real work. Because in the confrontation is the work. There's no other way. So, moving on, beliefs. You certainly have unconscious beliefs. This can also arise as a result of not the shadow, but the conscious thesis and the power position. So often in fact, pretty much all the time, we're rendering our experience in terms of what we know and in terms of what we assume. And this can also serve a kind of teleology where it's bringing about certain results in certain situations as a way to get us to face the dark side and the opposite of what we've come to believe. So, for example, if we have an unquestioned, unknown belief that maybe other people are just like rude, everyone in the world is just rude, where does that come from? Well, it might be that we've adopted a conscious thesis that maybe we're not rude, and that may well be quote unquote true in a sense. True insofar as we do behave that way. Yes, on a persona level, we carry ourselves as very polite. On a more authentic level, maybe we do embody good intentions. We genuinely care about the well-being of others and ourselves. We're included in that as well. But also, on the deepest level, we know that we have the potential for true kindness, for true manners. Now, there's many layers to that, right? In order to realize the underlying truth of the whole that we saw in the Hegel quote in the previous video, we're going to have to encounter the opposite. And not only that, but we've come to see ourselves as very polite or very kind. And that actually, up to a point, becomes a kind of zero-sum game where we get to feel kind and feel good and feel in control because we identify as this kindness and this politeness. And that's always helped us in the past. So there's a kind of attachment to this idea, and we feel good when we see ourselves that way and when others see us this way. So therefore, there's a kind of hidden benefit in seeing others as impolite. And it's very sneaky the way the mind can do this. And this is the trickster energy right here. It's when those two opposites are brought together and we trip over our own feet because we're so intent on being seen as polite that we actually become, is that an anti-Dromio again, we actually become completely impolite in our attempts to seem polite, perhaps. So we might then unconsciously surround ourselves with people or go and live in a place or hang out at a place where actually we're surrounded by people who are unkind, who are behaving unkind at the very least, and maybe even don't have good intentions for us either. So there's a place for saying, yeah, that's unkind, not only as a behavior, but also for saying, I see what's going on there, and it's a form of evil, right? It's unwholesome intention. It's the desire to drag me into a master-slave dynamic. It's not very polite. But if we are insisting on being seen as polite ourselves, are we not also, in some way, maybe not to the same degree, or although maybe, trying to drag others into a dynamic, right? Where we get to be the kind one, the polite one, and they get to be, the person who has the privilege of benefiting from our exalted kindness. So that's beliefs, likewise desires, because desire often given a bad rap, especially in Eastern traditions. But what is desire other than the impetus to move back to wholeness? So desire in itself is not the problem. It can be a problem when that impetus is commandeered, when it gets stuck, when it gets hung up in other things, and when it also wants to settle for what it has now rather than continue to circumambulate and move back to wholeness. And there's no getting around that. The world is not complete. There's a lot more to do here. And so we're always going to be involved in this ongoing dialectic. And so desires serve a purpose within that, this underlying tension we might feel from not being whole, not being complete, and from being able to do more. Now, like anything, there's a light side and a dark side to that. And it's justifiable, perhaps, that certain desires aren't allowed to come through at some points. And then they, of course, burst out in very unwholesome ways, in ways that we can't control. I mean, a very mundane, common example of this might be addiction to some kind of substance, or to sugar, or junk food. Right? We want to be in shape, be fit, but our body ends up doing something else. It's us that does it. It's us that goes to the shop and gets our wallet or purse out and buys the stuff and brings it home and then eats it. We do all of it. But there's a disconnect between what we consciously want and what we unconsciously want. And the two just aren't talking. Lastly here then, archetypes. So caveats here. The archetypes belong to the collective unconscious. The shadow in common speak usually means the parts of ourselves. Remember Hollis's quote, the parts of ourselves that we've rejected. But here's something that's not contained within this functional definition, because the shadow is, of course, also an archetype. The shadow is the archetype experience of the opposite, the challenger. I mean, look at Hollywood, right? Look at films like Batman, the Batman series. It's just a blatant shadow story. American Psycho, right? The main character who has this completely bifurcated life where he's just wearing a mask all day, and at night the shadow just comes out. It's slightly different stories, because American Psycho is more about the guy within himself confronting his own shadow, and of course Batman it's about them meeting each other, like Batman meeting these dark, menacing villains who actually reflect back to him a part of himself. In order to be who he really is, he has to assimilate part of them. Now, as insightful as these films are, they miss certain nuances about how this works, and the delineation, for example, between the quality being assimilated versus the moral valence itself and the intention, because clearly the villains they're all villains, right? They're just doing terrible things. No one's saying you should go around doing terrible things. What is it about these guys that we need to assimilate, that Bruce Wayne needs to assimilate? So easily now you can see how straightforward definitions of the shadow don't really capture the intricacies we need to really do shadow work. There's many layers to this, which I have passed out, and I'm going to be sharing it with you. I talk about quality, quantity, and direction. These are three different dimensions we need to think about when we're thinking about shadow. But for now, just understand this, that there's many, many layers to it, and some basic understanding might help you at a basic level. Like, yeah, I get that I can be a bit like that sometimes, and maybe I need to look at that. But that's the very, very first step of individuation. There's a lot more to come after that. And here's how you know. Because if you don't take it any further than that, you will get into encounters in life and experiences that force you to face it. That's why. What you don't know about your own mind will sooner or later get you in a situation where you have to confront it. So in the shadow map and in the shadow mapping model and service, I'm very clear that the shadow sits as an opposite to the conscious stance. So as much as we might show up with our conscious position in a way that's very powerful, in a way that's maybe even selfish, in a way that's even immoral. I would hope that no one watching this is going to use it for a moral ends, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's shadow. Technically speaking, right? So bring up the shadow map. Everything that's on the left-hand side of the screen here is some kind of shadow. There's the shadow position, which is the dark side of shadow, and it shows up in a very one-sided form. There's also the antithesis, which is the more wholesome aspect of this whole shadow realm. So all of that on the left-hand side is shadow. On the right-hand side, all of that pertains to the conscious position, whether that's the wholesome quality. Again, maybe it's kindness, right? Maybe it's politeness. Or whether that's the power position. Same flavor, different direction, different magnitude. It's of a higher quantity. It's politeness refined and maximized to the extreme. And maybe it's also being used for unwholesome intentions. That's another level we're going to get to. But you see here how, as unwholesome as that use of power may be, it's not technically the same as shadow, except for the fact that any idea taken to its extreme becomes its opposite. It's enantiodromia. In other words, power contains shadow. Shadow contains power. They can look so different, and yet in a moment you can see how actually much about them is the same. It's very fascinating. So the key, of course, is to engage in the inner work, alchemy, the reconciliation, and come back to the self by engaging with the light side of what's in the shadow realm on the left-hand side of the screen. So, next to a quote by Jung himself, he said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is a very widely shared quote by Jung, and I think it's a very good starting point for shadow work. It's simply understanding that whenever we experience anything, anyone doing anything, we're experiencing it through the lens of our own minds. This is to say nothing about the moral quality of what is being experienced. And that is something that we have to be able to do at some point. Nonetheless, until that point, let's just understand that there's always a reason that it impinges on our own mind the way that it does. In my 7 habits of individuation model, this is all about habit 1, to take responsibility for your mind. You cannot control what other people do, needless to say. God knows that we've all tried it, and we all do try perhaps at some point. This is what the power position is all about. It's trying to gain power over one's self or one's own mind and to carry out a thesis, rightly or wrongly. But this is about saying, okay, what does this actually mean to me? There's always something in it. Wherever there's an irritation, there's a tension. Wherever there's a tension, there's discord and energy going on. Remember that the shadow map is a model of energy. So it's just self-evident that whenever you experience an irritation of some kind, there's something there that's discordant. Now, I have to be very clear that this does not mean that it's all you, or that you caused it, that it's all your fault, or that you're ignorant if this happens. No, none of that at all. And this is a massive fallacy and problem that is taught in not just modern spiritual circles, but also shadow work groups, sadly. Is this almost unquestioned assumption that that if you experience something, it's just your own mind. And Jung never said that. The idealists certainly never said that. And to point out the obvious, it's a one-sided belief. There's nothing one-sided in this. So we have to go beyond that. But with that very important caveat, this is a very pithy quote by Jung, which we do well to bear in mind. We don't want to be jumping too far ahead and risk this crucial step and move on to just simply blaming, when actually there's not only truth in the fact that it's the way our mind relates to it, but there's also invaluable insight. And if you remember, it's all about contradiction and non-contradiction, right? If we're complaining about what we encounter in the world, whilst being simultaneously unwilling to reflect on what it shows us about our own mind, we've contradicted ourselves. Because now what we're saying is that everything would be better if I just got my way all the time. When practical truth is that, well, when we actually do that work, we don't get affected in the same way. The idea is not to eliminate suffering per se, but we can certainly use suffering as a way to understand conflicts in our own mind. Suffering is not the problem. I even make the case suffering is actually the solution. It doesn't mean we seek suffering out. We're not here to create suffering. But when it shows up, it shows us that there's a conflict going on. Suffering is a symptom, it's not the problem in itself. So then, let's move on to the next slide. More from Jung, this one from Concerning Rebirth in Collective Works 9. Right, in this one, just to preface this, this is where he likens the inferior function, that's a personality function, to the shadow itself. He goes, the inferior function is practically identical with the dark side of the human personality. The darkness which clings to every personality is the door into the unconscious and the gateway of dreams, from which those two twilight figures, the shadow and the anima, step into our nightly visions, or, remaining invisible, take possession of our ego consciousness. So I'll just pause there for a second. This is very relevant. So taking possession of our ego consciousness. So again, there's this link between the power position and the shadow position. They're not both shadow. There's the power, there's this side, there's the power, and there's the shadow. They're very much not the same, but they share this underlying factor. They're both completely distant from the self. It's like they've just gone out on a limb here, and they're so distant from what there is, from the center, from the centrum, from the self, that they've become very one-sided. And that they share. So in Jung's quote here, that the ego consciousness can be possessed by the shadow, or by the shadow or the anima. It still appears conscious. It will still be rendered in terms of the conscious position. Oh, I was just doing that because I'm trying to be productive. Oh, I'm just doing that because I'm trying to help you, or something. So it still sort of sounds like it's coming from a place of the conscious thesis, but actually it's like the shadow of being unhelpful, unkind, is taking over. That's a pretty good way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that simply it's self-negating. Again, this shadow map is a way of synthesizing the work of Hegel and the work of Jung. So ideas on determinate negation and also on shadow. And so a key thing to understand here is that any thesis contains its own contradiction. Let's use a very relevant example here. Jung is talking about personality type functions. If you're not familiar with that, no worries, it's very simple. For someone who shows up with, say, introverted thinking, it would be the technical name. This is like someone who's very logical, aims to be internally consistent with themselves. They want to model the world in such a way that it makes subjective sense. Maybe the stereotype would be like a scientist or like a nutty professor type character, right? Who's like exploring one hand, but also taking everything he's learning and filing it away somewhere in his mind and doing that internal work to try and find the answer, build systems in his mind, right? What's the opposite of that? Well, it depends what you mean by opposite. So the inferior function would actually be something called extroverted feeling, which is your typical hostess with the mostess, right? Somebody who's very socially attuned, makes decisions based on what is right for people emotionally. So you can see how it's opposite because it uses feeling and because it's extroverted, not introverted. But on the diagram I'm showing here, that's not actually what I've got. I've got introverted feeling, and there's good reasons for that, and that's because we're talking about qualitative opposites. But for the point being made here, it doesn't actually matter. The point is that what Jung is saying is that the inferior function, so that part that's the opposite of the way we tend to show up, the inferior function is the last in line. It's the opposite of the way we show up. He says that is practically identical with the dark side of the human personality. So it makes sense, right? It makes sense until you read it alongside everything else that's ever been written about the shadow, and you're thinking, what is the shadow? Is it the opposite? Is it what we resist? Is it the bits we repress? Is it the things we learn not to do as a child? And yeah, understandably, it can get quite confusing. And at the end of it all, you're not sure if you've really understood what's actually in your shadow. Now, there's a lot of value in mapping out the shadow, understanding easily at least 4 or 5 elements that can sit. You can draw out, this is what I do in the shadow mapping service. We work together, we draw out several shadow maps and really get precise. What is it that's in my shadow? Understanding that we'll never be able to pin it down in words. And also that the task is endless and impossible to complete, absolutely, just like our lives themselves. It doesn't mean that we stop living. It doesn't mean that we stop walking the path. It doesn't mean that we stop pursuing self-knowledge. But it is consistent with the theme that these are just ideas. These are just signposts towards you getting in touch with your own inner content. So a couple of points to take away there from Jung, and also just this way in which the shadow takes over the ego personality, but it's still shadow and it's taking over the conscious component of the personality. So continuing with the quote, he says, "A man who is possessed by his shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps. And if there is no doorstep for him to stumble over, he manufactures one for himself and then fondly believes he has done something useful." This too is just a reflection on enantiodromia and the necessity of opposites to rear themselves. I don't know about you, but whenever I read Jung, whenever I read anything like this, I cannot help but get philosophical. Why is it that this has to happen? Why is it not the case that we can just configure the world to be a certain way, that we can just find the theory of everything in physics and solve limitless energy and just live happily ever after? I don't want to open a can of worms at this late point in the video, but it comes back to this idea of non-contradiction. Ultimately, we as individuals in our potential and the universe at large have to embody a kind of non-contradiction, because otherwise nothing would make sense. Nothing would be possible. It wouldn't even be possible to perceive anything. There'd be nothing to create. This is where freedom comes in. Now, freedom is what there is. It is what we have. And you see, imagine you are totally free to do anything you want. You can make anything, you can manifest anything, just like that. You would find yourself sat exactly where you are. Because to manifest one thing brings about certain conditions, brings about certain necessity, brings about a certain compensation as a way to remain consistent with itself. So this is where Hegel offered a lot of value, speaking about determinate negation and the idea that everything contains its own contradiction, just like the introverted thinker. The more he doubles down on introverted thinking, the more he will contradict himself. And in the end, he actually needs to bring in a bit of feeling in order to think clearly. This is what it means. It's the same thing. It's the same reason why life as an idea taken to its extreme must defeat itself. That's why to be alive, you must die in the end. So that brings us to the end of this particular episode. So we're going to be moving on to part 4 next and talk about what exactly is shadow work. So I'll see you then.